take a look at what we need for fabric and what we need to do to prep cutting. First, you're going to need your white background fabric for your stashing and first border. The one thing I would like to note is don't cut these rectangles quite yet. We need to look at our blocks and determine the average size of them before we cut them to 16.5. Because maybe your blocks didn't finish at 16.5. Maybe they're at 16. Maybe they're at 16.25. Maybe they're even 16.75. And so we really want to make sure that we cut our stashings to match the size of our blocks. The 2.5 by width of fabric you will need for your first border. Your cornerstone shown here in the red fabric, 12 2.5-inch squares. You could make this any fabric that you would like, or even make it scrappy. Outer border will be the 10 6.5 by width of fabric, and we won't need binding, backing, and batting for today. So let's go over and look at our blocks and determine what size we do need to cut our stashing rectangles into. So the reason that we want to measure these first is that if this was actually larger than the 16.5, we're never going to be able to fit that stashing rectangle here. We would be short fabric. So we want to go through and determine the average size of our quilt blocks, because again, I'm all about making sure that your quilt lays flat. And if you are trying to put together a quilt with some blocks that are 16 and some that are 16.5 and some that are 16.25, it's not going to look good. Okay, you're going to tell that you tried to squeeze things in, you're going to lose some stuff. It's not going to lay flat when you go to quilt it. So it just becomes an even greater challenge. So what you want to do is you want to get your blocks out. I know it takes a couple minutes. It's an extra step, but you will be much happier in the long run. I'm going to take a large ruler here, and I'm going to put this down on top of my project. It's going to line up in the corner here. You can see I am at this block here. I'm 16.5 here, and at the bottom, I'm going to get around side. That on this corner, I'm just about 1/8 of an inch short from 16.5. I match it down here at the bottom, but it gets a little funny up here. And that's okay, because it's 1/8 of an inch. It's within the seam allowance, and I can match it to the edge of the block that does match 16.5, and we're good to go. And I'm going to work through looking at each set of blocks to make sure that I don't have any. See, that one's a perfect 16.5. I want to make sure I don't have any blocks that are significantly smaller than a 16.5. And by significantly smaller, again, I mean something that is like 16.25, 16, anything greater than 1/4 of an inch difference. Because what we want to do, if that's the case, is that is going to become that measurement that you cut all your rectangles to. So if all your blocks are measuring just about 16.25, you can go ahead and cut the length of your stashing rectangles to be that 2.5 by 16.5. Now, if you've got, 10 blocks that are 16.25 and you've got other blocks that are 16.5, you need to do a couple of things. One, you're either going to take your 16.25 blocks and go give them another press to see if you can get them to be 16.5, or you're going to take your 16.5-inch blocks and you're going to trim 1/8 of an inch off all the sides to get this block down to measure 16.25. Our ultimate goal is to get every block in our quilt to be the same size. Now, here is the suggested layout. Again, completely your quilt. You feel free to lay this out in any order that you would like. We're going to go through first and we're going to create the rows, and then we will put our rows together. The first row of this project is going to take the blocks and apply a stashing strip between them. So 4 blocks in a row with basically 3 stashing strips. That's your 2.5 by and whatever your blocks match. We're going to sew that between with a 1/4 inch seam, and we're going to press the seam allowances towards the stashing strip. We're also going to make these rows that contain a stashing strip and the cornerstone. So it'll be 4 stashing strips and 3 cornerstones. And we're going to do that until we have all of the rows that we need for the project. So you will have 5 rows of blocks with stashing, and we'll have 4 rows of stashing with corners. Now, when you go to press the stashing cornerstone row out, we're going to press the seams away from the cornerstone. Let's get to work. First up, I would be taking a stashing strip. I'm going to place it right sides together. I'm going to sew 1/4 inch. And I am going to do that to 3 blocks in the row. And then I will come back and attach the next block to that one there. Let's head on over to the machine and let's start sewing. Now that we have 1 row of blocks and 1 row of stashing strips piece, we can go to the iron. You remember, on your stashing cornerstone row, we are going to press the seams away from the cornerstone. And on the row of quilt blocks with the stashing in between, we're going to press the seams towards the stashing strip on each of the units. And it's kind of naturally how they want to go, so you won't have to fight with pressing them. These are going to want to fold inward, but we want them to go out. And remember, not only do you want to press them from the back, but we also want to press them from the front so that we can make sure that we are ironed all the way back across that seam allowance and we don't have any bubbles or lips in our pressing. We're going to go to the iron, press that, and then I will come back and show you how to join the 2 of these together. Once you have a row and a row of stashing together, we're basically going to take your stashing strip, you're going to place it right sides together, and this point here where this stashing on the block row and the stashing with the cornerstone, we're going to put right sides together, and this is our point of matching. This is why we press the seams the way that we did, is so that they interlock, and we want to make the seams at this point match. Now, when I'm doing matching points, I never pin through the point. I always pin in front of or behind the point. That way, when I remove the pin, it doesn't actually disturb the actual point. The points match. Now, as you're going along and you are pinning your points and matching things, if you're finding that you have like a little bit of excess in order to make something match, it's okay. When I go to sew this, for the most part, a little bit of a pull that disappears on here. And that's going to help if you put the fabric that has the bubble. Okay, so for me, the red fabric is my fabric that's too big or has the bubble. If I put that down towards the feed dogs on the machine, that little bit of pull that the feed dog is going to give is going to help ease that in. And so I will go through and we will match all the points, and all these intersections here, and then we'll go to the sewing. Now, I'm sewing with my sashing cornerstone strip on the bottom just because of that little bit of bubble I had in that one area. It really doesn't matter which direction you sew your sashing strip to your unit. Now that that unit is sewn to our row unit, we are going to go and press this strip. We are going to press towards the sashing cornerstone unit away from the block. So for me, I'm going to lay this on the ironing board with the sashing cornerstone strip up. We're going to set the seam, and then we're going to flip back and press again so that the seam goes towards this unit. And then I'm going to continue on. I'll add another block unit and another cornerstone row unit and continue all the way down until the center of my quilt is assembled. Now that the center of your top is all assembled, we're going to work through how to put on borders to a quilt top. Many of you may put on borders and just attach to the side and sew down and trim off the extra. I'm going to teach you how you technically should do it to help guarantee that your quilt will lay as flat as possible when you go to lay it on a bed or to quilt it on a frame, anything in that aspect. So the first thing that we need to do is to sew all of the 2.5-inch strips together to create one long strip. And I'll show you in a few moments on how to join them together. But first, you're going to give your quilt a good iron. I know it's big. It should be about 70 by 88-ish. Give it a good press. Hopefully you have some space that's large enough to lay it out flat, because we need to take some measurements. Now I'm going to start with my horizontal measurements based upon the image that you see here. So I'm actually going to take 3 measurements. I am going to measure through the center of the quilt. I am going to measure approximately, like 6 to 8 inches down from the top, and then again 6 to 8 inches up from the bottom. Our hope is that those 3 measurements are pretty close to what we want, and we want all 3 of them to be pretty close to the same, if not identical. So on my quilt, this was 70 1/4. This one at the bottom was 70, and up top here we were at about 70 1/2. Now I can see just by looking at this top corner, either I didn't lay it all the way down flat, or there's definitely an issue with this block in the corner. I just think it's not laid flat. But I've got 3 measurements here. And as you can tell, I probably could iron it just a tad better than what it's showing here. But you can add these 3 measurements up, and we can take an average. So if I add all 3 of these measurements, and then we divide by 3, it's going to give me just about 70 1/4. Okay, it's like 70.2 something. I'm going to cut 2 strips from that really long 2.5-inch white fabric strip that we just created. I'm going to cut 2 of them at 70 1/4 inches in length. And mostly because nowadays, for me, I don't even take an average. I look at what the center of my quilt is. The center of the quilt is 70 1/4. And ultimately, we don't really have the ability to adjust or stretch or ease the center of the quilt. We do have the ability at the top and the bottom edge to kind of stretch things out or ease things in. So it is much easier to be able to, pull this out an additional 1/4 of an inch and to squeeze this end in an additional 1/4 of an inch so that they all measure 70 1/4 versus trying to figure out how we're going to take this center section and either stretch it out or suck it in. So I'm going to cut 2 strips of fabric, like I said, 70 1/4 inches in length, which I have here. I have 2 strips, 70 1/4 inches in length. I'm going to fold that right sides together to find middle, and then I'm going to fold it in half again to find 1/4. So I have a nice crease here, and then I have 2 creases here and here on my strip. Okay. Now, if you need to join your strips together or you're not sure how to join your strips together, let me show you. You're going to take 1 strip, you're going to place it right side up on the counter. And I'm going to do this with the outer border so that you can see a right and wrong side to it. Here is my outer border strip. So we're going to have to do this with the inner and outer border as well. So I've got 1 horizontal and 1 perpendicular. We are, get that to stay here, going to take a ruler and a marking pen. And I'm going to draw a line from corner to corner on this unit. And I do offset it. And you can see I didn't cut my selvage off. Just going to slide that over so that when I go to sew this on this line, I'm going to sew right on top of that line. That's going to give me a nice diagonally piece. I'm going to pin it so that I can pull back and show you what it's going to look like. If I sewed this, I pull it back and it will piece it in. And then I can, when I trim, I'm going to trim a 1/4 inch away from where I sewed. And I'm going to cut this all off. So it's not necessary for me to pre-cut my selvages off. I'm just going to put the selvage above this strip and bring this strip inside this particular selvage. But we'll revisit that when we get to joining our fabric strips. You can, if you like, just put your strips right sides together, and you can sew a straight seam, and that's fine too. I just prefer a diagonally pieced seam. For me, it can be a little less obvious that it's pieced, and I'll show you that too when we get to doing the outer border. Now that we've got this piece, our inner border is folded and creased. We're going to get our quilt top, and we're going to fold our quilt top in half and then in half again. Here's my quilt top. I am going to be folding and creasing along the top and bottom of the quilt. So I have the top row here. I'm going to fold in half. I'm going to find the middle. So I've got my quilt folded in half here. Everything lines up. It's hard to see here. Such a big quilt. I'm going to put a crease in there. You can mark it with a pin if you like, or just give it a really good crease. Camera, I'm mark it with a pin. Now, instead of taking this and folding it in half again, I'm actually going to open this up. I'm going to bring one edge into the center, and then I'm going to crease that. That's going to give me the midpoint. And the reason why I don't leave it folded and fold again is you've got a lot of layers of fabric. It's not as accurate as it can be if you try to fold all those layers at once. Again, middle. I'm going to take my other end, bring that in, match it to that pin. mark that crease. That one. Now, I'm going to take my strip that I cut to 70 1/4 inches in length. I am going to place it right sides together. Again, there's no right or wrong to this because we're dealing with white fabric. And I'm going to match my creases to my pin. That point, this pin, and we're going to make the creases match. Don't worry about trying to make sections flat and in between. We'll come back and deal with that because remember that top row of measurements that I did and the bottom row of measurement that I did do not match the length that I cut my strip to. We're going to have to do some easing. And then I'm going to take the end and I'm going to match the end. Now we're going to go sew together. Okay, I'm just going to kind of look between each set of pins to see that I am going to a little excess here. So I'm going to sew with this down towards the feed dogs. That'll help ease in that little bit of excess that we have. And we're going to sew 1/4 inch. That's all the pins I put in. I do not pin a lot on a border. It's mostly just those midpoints, half points, and ends. Just straighten up each section as I get to it. I sew to my hand, I stop, I align the next section of fabric, and then sew to my hand. Like that, that's the end of my top strip. This strip was cut 70 1/4 and this top of this quilt was 70 1/2. So everything eased in and matched up perfectly. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to repeat this process on the opposite end of the quilt, and we're going to attach the other 70 inch, 70 1/4 for me. Your measurements may be different, and to the other end, and then we'll come back. We'll talk about ironing and how to put the next border strips on. That both top and bottom inner borders are attached. We're going to press them so that the seams go away from the center of the quilt and towards the border. And then we're going to lay it back out and we're going to take 3 more measurements. This time, we're going to measure basically parallel to the seam that we're going to sew. We're going to measure middle, about 6 inches over from the left to the right. Now, for my quilt, all 3 of these measured 93 inches. But if yours don't, do exactly like we did before. Look at your 3 measurements. You can kind of take an average and then look at that average and convert it to something that you can cut with a rotary cutter, or really pay attention to the center strip or the center measurement, because again, that is very challenging to try to ease or stretch within the middle of the quilt, but much easier on the left and the right. Once you have your measurement, you're going to cut your 2 border strips to that length, and we're going to repeat the same process of folding them in half to find your bin points, and then we're going to do the same with the quilt top. So I've picked my quilt top up here. I've folded it in half. On this side, the half point is actually right in the center seam of that block. And then I'm going to open up. Now you may be wondering, well, why worry about doing all this marking if I've already cut this strip to match the measurement that I need? Well, the reason that we do this is so that the area in which we need to ease or stretch is kind of pointed out to us versus us trying to ease it all in the last few inches of the block. That may not be, right here, may not be where the issue is. The issue in terms of size could be between here and here. And so this allows us to split or identify the measurement issue or the sizing issue, and then also allow us to distribute the excess or shortage to within an area all the way across the quilt versus waiting until the last few seams or the last few inches to do so. So that's why we take that extra step and do those measurements and then align to those. Just like we did before. Look between. There's a bit right there. We're going to go sew 1/4 of an inch. We're going to press this seam away from the center of the quilt as well. And then we're going to attach the other border opposite of this one, just like we did before. Now, one thing I will point out is I originally had talked to you about piecing the strip. Then I looked in the instructions as a reminder, measurements, and she tells you in the pattern to piece your strips end to end. She does not tell you to do that on the angle, and so that concerns me in that I'm not sure we would have enough yardage specifically for the outer border if you did piece them on the diagonal. So I will, when we get to that border here in a moment, I'm going to piece mine straight across just because I'm going to be 90% sure that what she said to do here, she tells you to sew the strips together end to end. Okay, and so that end to end right there makes me question if there is enough yardage to do the piecing on the diagonal. Head on over to the machine. Keep sewing on those borders. Now that both borders are on, both side borders of our first border, we're going to go to the iron and we're going to press the seam towards the border. Then we're going to lay it out and we're going to measure again to start adding the final border to our quilt top. Now that the inner border is on completely and pressed, we're now going to start working with the outer border. Now we're going to repeat the same steps that we just did with the inner border, except this time we will be measuring the same way, but using the other fabric. And we want to make sure that we include the added on inner border to our measurement. And I'm going to repeat the process in the same order that I did the inner border. So therefore, I'm going to be sewing on the top and bottom border of this quilt first. So therefore, I am going to take 3 measurements, again, to the middle and to 8 inches down, find my common number there, and then cut my border to that length. Now, if you remember, I talked about the border piecing together, and I had talked about piecing it on the diagonal, which really is my preferred method. However, the designer has not given you enough fabric to piece this border together in that manner. So you are going to want to trim off your selvage edges, give yourself a nice straight edge. You are going to place your borders right sides together, and we're going to sew 1/4 of an inch. We're going to sew 1/4 inch. I want to make sure that I back stitch at the top and at the bottom. And I'm going to do this with all the strips. I'm just going to sew them into one big giant long piece so that they're all together. By also doing this, it will allow the piecing seams to be in different locations throughout the quilt. Whereas if we take two pieces, sew them together, and then put one on one side of the quilt, and then do the same put on the other, visually they could line up in the same location. And if I have to, I'd much rather these seams be in not the same place on both sides of the quilt. I am going to go to the iron and I will press this seam open so that it will be ready to use. And again, we're going to repeat this with all 10 strips, I believe, and then we're going to cut this down, cut 2 strips down to the measurement that we have chosen for our first top and bottom border of this section of our quilt. Once we have that, we're going to repeat, fold in half, fold in quarters to get a nice crease, and then we are going to end here. So here's my border. We're going to fold in half. Not my border. Don't worry about the selvage. We're going to fold in half. We're going to iron, and then we're going to fold in half and iron. That's going to give us the halfway point and the 2 quarter points. And then we're going to do the same with our quilt. We want to make sure that when we fold it in half, we're doing it so that we'll be creasing the edge of the quilt that we're going to be attaching this border to. And then we will match our creases on the quilt to the creases in the border, and then match end to end, and we will sew it together with a 1/4 inch seam, and then we will press the seam towards the border or away from the quilt. Once your top and bottom final border are attached to the quilt, we are going to again repeat the same process. We are going to measure from top to bottom, including the newly pieced border to the middle, and about 6 to 8 inches, obviously a straight line. Obviously not draw a straight line with the mouse, but measure a straight edge from top to bottom in all 3 locations. Find your measurement, and then you're going to cut your final 2 borders to that length. We will then fold your creases in both the border piece and in the quilt top, match, pin, and then we'll head on over to the machine and we will sew our 1/4 inch and then do our final pressing. Once your final border is pressed, there is your completed beautiful day block of the month mystery. To do one more pressing there, I've got to move to a larger ironing board. What I have in the film studio is not large enough, nor is the floor space either. But there is your project. Now, we had talked about maybe some quilting. I would not recommend quilting this quilt in the embroidery hoop. This quilt is approximately 86 by 104. It is way too large for you to do inside the embroidery hoop. You can try, but it is going to be a lot of hooping. You just need to make sure that you are conscious of the weight that is laying on your module arm while the machine is moving. I am going to quilt this via a long arm with just an edge-to-edge pantograph. I'm not going to do any sort of custom quilting on this particular quilt just because I don't feel like the layout really calls for it. Custom quilting would be, I would consider it if I had like a blank square in between squares, but the quilt itself is fairly, I hate to say busy because it's not really busy, but when you spend all that time custom quilting, not really any particular areas that you can see it or you can make it a focal point. So for me, an edge-to-edge pantograph is going to be perfectly fine for this particular project. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us over the last few months. We hope that you have learned something, taken a time to maybe refresh your skills, learned something new, and we look forward to seeing you in more projects soon. Thanks, everybody.